Like I said this morning, we began Matthew chapter 7. This whole chapter can be looked at through the lens of judgment. It begins in Matthew 7 and verse 1 with the famous verse, judge not lest ye be judged. Obviously, this is one of the most misquoted verses, one of the most misunderstood, and it's one of the most misapplied verses. So many people look at this and say, well, Jesus here is saying, do not cast a judgment. But really what Jesus is saying, stop the way you've been judging and learn this way. Because they had learned a way that was wrong. They had learned a way of judgment that has been wrong. And that fits in the pattern of the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, he talked to them in Matthew chapter 5. He told them, these are all different teachings that you've heard and you've learned in the wrong way. Chapter 6, these are all practical things of righteousness that you've learned to do in the wrong way. And now chapter 7, you have been taught how to judge incorrectly, whether by word or example. And so I want to tell you how to do it correctly. And so in looking at how to do it correctly, we looked in verses 1 through 5 this morning, and we saw that we are to judge with fairness. Judge with fairness. And part of that fair judgment means don't go out of your way to judge. Don't go out of your way to judge. Jesus gave the example of a man who had a speck in his eye, and how he was being judged by another man who had a large log sticking out of his own eye. The picture that was given there illustrates that of the scribes and the Pharisees, how they were those who had a major blight, a plight of sin in their life. They had forgotten mercy, they had forgotten compassion. Luke's account says they had forgotten the love of God, and how they would stop and they would analyze people with the intent to find faults in them, and they would search thoroughly to find that fault. Then we looked in verse 6. In verse 6 we saw that we are to judge morally. Jesus says, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. What Jesus is saying there, you need to judge with morality. You need to judge with a sense of what's right, what's wrong. Do I stay? Do I go? Do I continue in this? Do I not continue this? Is this godly or is this not godly? You have to make those sorts of decisions. We talked about the gospel, how you might be in a scenario, you might be in a circumstance where you've been teaching the gospel to someone. You have to make a decision. Do I continue teaching this person? Do I continue devoting this attention and this time and all this effort towards this one person? Or do I shake the dust off my sandals and continue on to the next home? That's a tough decision that often has to be made in places like the mission field. Here in the States, here with our neighbors, our friends, we don't have to make that decision too often. We have each and every day to continue to work and chisel on someone. But in the mission field, oftentimes you're given a week or 2 weeks. And so you have to make that decision pretty fast. But that decision, or that matter of judgment, the judging with morality, that has to do with more than the gospel, of course. That has to do with moral issues, like should I watch this television show or not? And it comes down to it because in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, we're told to have our mind set on heavenly things. That's the emphasis that Paul was placing there. Have your mind on heavenly things. Have your mind on godly things, that which is holy. And we ourselves, we are that which is holy. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, we are a royal priesthood, a chosen people, a holy nation. And we should not be casting ourselves. You got to think about it. Whenever you watch a movie laced with profanity or with nudity and things of that nature, bad media, or just most things in the world, really, if you put yourself in that, what you're doing is you're offering what is holy yourself to what is unholy. And Jesus says you would never give what is holy to a dog. You wouldn't throw down your pearls just for pigs to trample on it. Pigs don't care about pearls. Why would you do that with your own self? You are holy. Don't throw yourself away. And then in verses 7 through 11, we saw that we are to judge with prayer. Judge with prayer. Prayer should be at the heart of all of our judgments. We looked there and we thought about Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 9. He was given that unique opportunity by God to ask for whatever his heart desired. And Solomon asked for wisdom. so that he could rightly judge the people. And so as we look at our judgments, the way that we cast judgment, the way that we think about things, we need to be doing them with prayer at the center. If there's ever a difficult situation that arises, ever a conflict that comes about in the church, we need to go before the Lord before we take the decision before the people. That's what we need to do. This evening, we're going to continue looking here in Matthew 7, and we're going to begin here in verse 12. Look with me in verse 12. We are to judge with mercy. Judge with mercy. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. We know this verse as the golden rule. The golden rule. And it's so simple. Would you like to have this done to you? Well, no. Okay, then don't do it to someone else. Would you like to be treated this way? Yes. Well, that's the way you need to treat someone else. This kind of echoes back to Matthew 7 and verse 2, whenever he began this discussion on judgment. He said in Matthew 7 and verse 2, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you." And so you have the same principle of mercy being applied there, but this particular verse, verse 12, places an emphasis on the grace that you would hope to find. You need to place yourself in someone else's shoes before you go ahead and you cast that judgment. And I want to be sure to make this known that this doesn't necessarily deal with doctrinal faults. This isn't all that he's talking about here. He's not just talking about if someone is caught in adultery, act as if you were in the adultery. Yes, that's a good way to go about it, right? But this goes beyond doctrinal things. This can deal with things as simple as dealing with someone who lacks good common sense, right? You ever just see someone lacking good common sense and you just want to say, "What is wrong with you? Are you dumb?" We want to say stuff like that sometimes. But imagine if you were in that place. This has to do with the type of individual in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 22 that you are halfway tempted to call a fool. This is a practical command that Jesus is passing here. Think as if you were that person. How would you want to be talked to? Let's say you have a kid at the congregation. He's been driving his car around with no oil in the engine. Car breaks down. He asks you for help. "Hey, I need help. I don't know what the issue is." You look, there's no oil. If you were in that place, would you want the adult, the elder of the congregation, whoever it may be, to look at you and go, "What in the world is wrong with you? Do you have no sense?" Well, of course we wouldn't want that. We would want someone to be gentle with us, because I'm not an expert in automobiles, and so because of that, I probably haven't given any thought to it, right? This is a practical command that Jesus is saying here. This is more than seeing your brother messing up and walking by so that you don't say a word. Sometimes we think that Matthew 7 and verse 12 is covered by that we see someone making a mistake and we know my immediate impulse would be to look at them and say, "You fool." And so what I'm going to do to fulfill Matthew 7 verse 12, I'm just going to walk by. I'm not going to say anything. That's not what Jesus is telling you to do. This actually kind of promotes the idea of stopping your day and helping them. I mean, think as if you were that person. You broke down on the side of the road. Everyone's coming by. And what you want, I don't know if you've ever been broke down on the side of the road. I've been broke down on the side of the road way too many times. Way too many times in my life. And I remember just thinking sometimes, man, I wish someone would just stop and ask me if I need help. I wish someone would just stop and help me for a moment to change this tire. So on and so forth. And so whenever we look at Matthew 7 verse 12, the golden rule, this teaching that we are to judge with mercy, that's kind of what Jesus is pushing us to do. is to not just withhold evil from someone, but withhold evil and do good to them. So judge with mercy. Let's look here at verses 13 and 14. We are to judge with different minds. Judge with different minds. It says in verse 13, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. Verse 14, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. When we look here at this context, Jesus is presenting two different paths that you can go on. And there's one path that is very broad. And he tells us that many people are going in it. And so if you're someone who thinks like the world, this is where you're going to want to go. You want to go with your friends. You want to go where the people are going. You want to follow the crowd. And so you're going to continue in this way. And not only do you have to be a crowd pleaser or a crowd follower to go in this way, but you could be someone who's slothful. It tells us that this way is easy. And so you say, man, I don't really want to do a whole lot. You know, it's kind of like you see, you're digging a trench, right? You and someone are digging a trench. You see them with the shovel and you say, I don't want to dig. Now that's an inside joke. But this right here is, you're looking at it and you're saying, I think that's where I want to go because that's going to cost me the least. That's going to cost me the least. That's the world's way of thinking. Jesus presents this other place, this narrow gate, that is difficult to go by. Very few people are going to go there. And he says, that's the one you need to go through. That's the one you need to go through. If you look at this Broadway, you can imagine that it has this gate around it. I don't know if you've ever seen mansions or something like that. I remember I went to the Newport Mansions last August. I went to Newport Mansions. Me and my family, we went to Boston, and we went to the Newport Mansions, which are in Rhode Island, I think. And what the Newport Mansions are is it's a collection of, and this blows my mind, summer homes of the world's wealthiest people from 100 years back. You have a mansion there that was built by the Vanderbilt family. Actually, two that were built by the Vanderbilt family. And the thing that I always think of whenever I think about this easy way, this way that leads to destruction, is the Vanderbilt Mountains gates. I don't know what would be a good representation, but if you've been inside of our building, you see this whole area. I wish I could rotate the camera a little bit, but there's this whole area that goes from wall to wall, from sidewall to sidewall. That was the size of the gates that went into their home. Whenever you went through these gates, you had to go through these gates to get into the mansion, to go and tour the mansion. Whenever you go through these gates, there were easily 50 people walking aside me and my family. That's whenever I think of. And whenever I think of the narrow gate, the idea is kind of like this little spot between two shrubs. It's kind of like, you ever seen the movie, what's the baseball movie with the kids? The Sandlot. Kind of like the Sandlot. You remember in the Sandlot, they have the plank of wood that they would go in between and the fence? That's kind of what comes to my mind with the narrow gate. The narrow gate is not a place where you can extend your arms and walk through freely. The narrow gate is not even a place where you can walk like this comfortably. The narrow gate is kind of like this place you got to just squeeze in by. And maybe you got to suck in your gut whenever you go in. And you've got to really want it. You got to really want it because you got to be looking for it. And you got to be willing to work for it. You got to be willing to live a difficult life to have it. But Jesus says this is the one you need to go in. You need to go in this one. Yeah, you don't see anyone else going in it, but that's where you need to go. Now, why is it the case? Why is it the case that why is it the case that we go for the narrow gate? Each one of us, we have decided in our baptism that we are going to go through the narrow gate. Why is that? Well, the reason is because we have different minds. We have minds, Romans 12 verses 1 and 2, that have been transformed by the gospel. We have different aspirations in the world. Philippians 3 and verse 14, Paul talked about how his goal was the upward call. That was the prize, to go to heaven, to be claimed by Christ, to have that home with God. And it's interesting because in Philippians 3, he talks about the things which he formerly claimed to make him glorious. The fact that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, he was of the tribe of Benjamin, he was circumcised on the 8th day. And the point in saying that is he's looking and he goes, these are all the things I relished in. These are all the things I thought were important. These are all the things that I use. These are all the things that I aspire to be. I aspire to be the greatest Jew. And he looks at his life now that he has been transformed. He says, I aspire to go to heaven. That's what we do. We have different aspirations. We have a different pattern of life that was taught to us. Ephesians 4 verses 17 through 21, Paul says, do not walk as the Gentiles walk, for they walk in the futility of their minds. But instead, you need to walk how you were taught Christ. That's what we do. We judge with a different mind. We look at situations differently. We have made a decision. We have made a judgment that I'm not going to go the easy way. I'm not going to go where everyone else is going. I'm not going to be who everyone else is aspiring to be, but instead I'm going to go where God is. I'm going to be who God aspires me to be. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. That's judgment with a different mind.
To totally different destination.
You
got to make the decisions, because these are not just ways of life. There's a destination, different destinations at the end of each one of these paths. There's not one that wraps back around from the Broadway that leads to life. No. You got to choose what you want and walk that path.
Yeah, you got to really want it, man.
Yeah.
Two different destinations. I mean, you look at that stuff. I mean, you look at poetry. You look at the way that people use hyperbole. What is the strongest exaggeration people often use? Life or death? It is a matter of life or death. Jesus is saying here, the way you choose to go, the judgment that you make is a matter of life or death. But we make the decision to have life. Why? Because we judge differently. Look with me at verses 15 through 20. We judge with doctrine. We judge with doctrine. This is going to be the last section that we cover, by the way. That way we have some to cover on Wednesday. But this will be the last section that we're going to cover. So if you're looking at the clock, know that we're actually towards the end, probably 10 or 15 more minutes, just so you'll know. But verses 15 through 20, we judge with doctrine. Read this with me. It says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Verse 16, you will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. Verse 18, a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Jesus says we judge with doctrine. We judge with what is true. There stands the fact that we have to make a decision. We have to be willing to cast a decision on who we allow to teach us and who we don't allow to teach us. When we're looking here at verses 15 through 20, we're talking about teachers. We're talking about people who stand and say, this is the word of the Lord. We're talking about people who occupy the pulpit, people who occupy classrooms, people who have that sort of influence in a congregation or in a Christian university, things of that nature. And Christ is saying here, you need to judge these people. You need to look at these people and say, is this a good tree or is this a bad tree? Well, is there good fruit on that tree or is there bad fruit on that tree? We know that those who teach, they're going to receive a greater judgment. We see that in 2 Peter chapter 2, those, as well as in the book of James, that those who teach, they will receive a greater judgment. They will be held accountable for the things which they teach. They are handling the most precious thing in the world in their hands. They're handling the gospel, and so how well they handle the gospel is going to determine what sort of grace is measured to them or what sort of wrath is poured upon them. Something this passage makes me think about is hearsay. Oftentimes, we make judgments based upon hearsay. And, sometimes the temptation to listen to hearsay, or the temptation to resist hearsay can be pretty hard, because sometimes we have someone that we place a lot of trust in, and we trust their opinion, we trust their thoughts about stuff, and so whenever they come to you and say, well, so-and-so is actually sound, or so-and-so is liberal, we tend to buy into it. But Jesus is telling us, you need to make your own inspections. You need to make your own inspections. And something to think about here is, Jesus is saying this in the midst of a crowd. And in the midst of this crowd are the scribes and Pharisees, the people who are these ravenous wolves, who actually, in their own teaching, they look at Jesus and they try to tell the people, that's the ravenous wolf right there. That's the guy trying to mislead you. We're trying to lead you into the paths of righteousness. And here he is trying to deter you. He's talking about some church that he's going to start. And he wants you to follow him. Don't follow him. That's what the scribes and Pharisees say. When we look here at verses 15 through 20, Jesus is almost just opening up like, look, I know these people over here, they're going to tell you, don't listen to me. And I'm going to tell you, of course, don't listen to them. What I want you to do is look at our life. Look at the things we teach. Look at the way we behave. Look at the way we put righteousness into practice. And determine for yourself, is this person right or is that person right? Sometimes in the church, it's a good reminder to remove the hearsay, remove whatever a faithful brother says about some other brother, and just look at it for yourself. I think about how fast word travels and how much faster it can misrepresent someone. I've heard some people who are called liberal actually be conservative. They'd be on the same line as us. And then I've heard of other people who say, oh, well, they're conservative and perhaps they're actually extremists, or they're liberals themselves, or so-and-so is an extremist. And so you talk to them about it and you actually find out they have a more mellow heart than someone else led on. We have to be willing to make those judgments for ourselves. We have to be investigating those things on our own. We need to be looking for those things thoroughly. When we look here in chapter 7, so far what we've talked about in chapter 7, in verses 1 through 5, when we judge, we need to have fairness. We need to judge fairly. In verse 6, we need to judge with morality. We need to decide what is right and wrong and stick to it. We need to judge with prayer, verses 7 through 11. That means that we include God on what judgments we're doing or we're making. Verse 12, we're to judge with mercy. This is practical. I need to put in practice. And I need to consider, well, how would I want to be treated? And then in verses 13 and 14, we are to judge with different minds. We are to think as God would have us to think. Try your best to think upon the pattern which God thinks. And in verses 15 through 20, we need to judge with doctrine. We need to judge based upon the truth. We need to hold these different teachers up, these men and such up, and compare what they're saying, what they're teaching, how they're living, with what the Word of God says about this is what you teach and this is how you live. That's what Jesus is telling us to do. This coming Wednesday, we're going to look at verses 21 through 29. 21 through 29, that means we're going to look at two more things about judgment, and then we're going to notice the great astonishment that takes place in verse 28, and then we're going to say some concluding remarks about the Sermon on the Mount. So I want to encourage you to continue to read the Sermon on the Mount. Continue to read it from chapter 5 to chapter 7. Think about it. Think about how this all pieces together. I know one of the, I guess, the interesting things about the Sermon on the Mount, or just the Bible in general, is we can look at a section of Scripture. We can look at chapter 7 and we can say, this is all about judging, right? But we could also look at it and say, well, this is all about ... or this is all about ... When we look at the Bible, something that should just take our breath away is how applicable it is on a multiplicity of topics. Everything we see here, everything we have in the Bible can be taught so many different ways and still taught accurately. And so don't just look at this forever as, well, chapter 7 is all about judging, and so I'm going to leave it that way. Think about it other ways too. Think about it for yourself. Don't just look at it and say, well, I heard it this way, that's what it is, that's what I'm going with until I leave this place. No, continue to study, continue to look at it. It is so rich, and really, whenever I say chapter 7 is all about judgment, I mean, that's looking at a topic that flows through consistently through this chapter. So